Speak. No. Speak. No, it's not very loud. This is what I want. I would call it. Speak. Testing. Testing. Right. Thank you.
Excuse me. Can everyone hear the lecturer?
Yes.
If we can.
Okay.
You haven't heard me yet.
I'm not giving the lecture.
Oh, you introduced.
See, I know. Yes, I'm introducing it.
My bad. I was doing it to the doctors. There we go.
And are you sure it hasn't got an echo?
What happens is if there's an echo, then I'll just turn down the volume.
The volume?
Just speak for me. So that
now, we have done this once before. Is there an echo? No? You sure? Everybody here? Yeah. Not loud enough?
it's on as well.
I think it's on the maximum it will go. You're just too large an audience, you're absorbing the sound.
You can just speak with it.
Okay. Yes. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I think this lecture by Jean Moorcroft Wilson has been very eagerly anticipated, and we'd like to welcome her again. And she has been coming to summer school now for more than 10 years, having first come when she was doing research on Isaac Rosenberg, the First World War poet. And as you may know, Jean is an authority and has done a number of biographies of First World War poets. In fact, her biography, Volume 1 of Robert Graves, has just been published to great acclaim, and everybody's eagerly awaiting Volume 2 now. So she has something. But I think it's particularly exciting for us that she has come here to talk about the Bloomsbury Group, because who better, in fact? You are really getting it from the horse's mouth. Because, as you may know, her husband Cecil is a nephew of Leonard Woolf, the publisher, and his connections to the Bloomsbury Group are very well known, and you will be hearing more about them. And she has a number of sort of inside pieces of information, anecdotes and so forth, which will make it particularly interesting to you. I see she already has had a portrait of Virginia Woolf. For those of you who are interested, we are showing a film about the Bloomsbury Group and Virginia Woolf's biography in particular on Monday morning at 9:15 to pick up these lectures by Jean. But it also gives me a special pleasure because as an alumna of University College London, I lived in Bloomsbury as a student, and we often went, we had a key to Gordon Square, and so for me this is home ground, and it is particularly nice for me to welcome Jean and say how happy we are to have her here. Thank you.
Okay. I'll just put it on here if I may. Yes? Thank you very much. What a wonderful audience. I wasn't quite sure whether you would have been bored, because I know many years ago, about 9 years ago, I did give a full course on the Bloomsbury Group. I'd love to repeat it, the only problem is many of you were at it, so I won't. But this is an attempt, a very feeble attempt as it must be, to summarise what happened and who they were, when they lived, what they stood for. And when this all took place, I want to give you, I think, some hope, some kind of introduction that will encourage you to go and find out more about this rather intriguing group. I asked a friend just before the end of summer school this year, I said, what does one have to do to get a large audience? I said, look, the Bloomsbury Group gets a large audience. She said, sex. And if it's sex, well, welcome to Bloomsbury. Although I shall try not to be quite so frivolous all the way through the lecture. Why is it that Bloomsbury attracts so much interest, even here, thousands of miles from its origins, apart from the sex, I mean? One fairly obvious reason must be the result of what in England we call the nostalgia industry. I'm sure you have it here. After more than a century, Bloomsbury has a ready appeal for those who find the past more interesting or more acceptable than the present. It seems somehow softened, doesn't it? And even for those who don't, there is still a certain fascination in the past. The most ordinary objects and customs often become hallowed by time, hence the popularity of TV adaptations or films of books like Brideshead Revisited, The Forsyte Saga, or more recently, and I'm very proud to say I actually have seen it, couldn't stop once I'd started, Downton Abbey. How's that for nostalgia industry? In all of these, we watch, intrigued as the characters' personal lives unfold. And the same, it would seem, has become true of Bloomsbury. And thanks to the spate of memoirs, biographies, letters, diaries, films, and other ephemera, we can now follow the fates of Bloomsbury's major, and as we go on, all the minor ones too, of Bloomsbury's. It has, in effect, become a kind of intellectual soap. Virginia Woolf, for example, the high priestess of Bloomsbury, who once ironically said that she needed to be, quote, private, secret, as anonymous as possible in order to write. She has herself become, in the words of one commentator, the Marilyn Monroe of American academia, both a commercial as well as a cultural icon. And against an increasingly insecure and grim background of world recession, and not to mention the British recession, there is, I think, a significant element of wish fulfillment attached to this interest in Bloomsbury. After all, even allowing for the passage of time and an increasingly mechanized and commercialized world, Bloomsbury's members were privileged. I always make an exception here, and you'll probably think it's family interest, but I do make an exception for Leonard, whose father was a brilliant QC barrister, but whose father died very young of TB at the age of 46, and who left the family what I would consider relatively poor, but certainly not up to the standard of the other members. But for the most part, they were people of leisure, with time and money enough to develop their artistic and conversational skills, to live in their own very attractive houses, and to indulge in the fascinating business of personal relationships. Their lifestyle seems to us now rich and exotic, unfettered by regular jobs and the need to make money. Together with severe recessions, our contemporary world has seen a frightening disintegration in the structure of society, and an added appeal of Bloomsbury may be that it seems a very solidly structured group, a very solidly structured society in which they move. One unquestionable reason for Bloomsbury's popularity, however, and one which I have of course anticipated, is lies in changing attitudes towards sexuality. Bloomsbury's relative sexual freedom and tolerance of most shades of sexual choice, I say most, I won't go into detail here, you'll have to come to next year's course to find out about that, has always fascinated certain sections of the public, but its real popularity started in the 60s, an era of increasing sexual freedom. There may also be an element of prurience, of course, in those often three-sided relationships carried out in Bloomsbury's mainly garden squares. They lived in squares painted in circles and loved in triangles. I've tried to find out who that was for years. It's Dorothy Parker, as one might have imagined. She was just jealous, wasn't she? Vanessa Bell's relationship, first with Clive Bell, then Roger Fry, and finally Duncan Grant, who himself was courted by Lytton Strachey, won briefly by Maynard Keynes, and lured into fatherhood by Vanessa Bell, cannot help but intrigue. Virginia Woolf's own sexual ambivalence, for there's no doubt that she was passionately in love with Vita Sackville West for a time, although I personally think that's been made rather too much of. But also she loved her husband, Leonard Woolf, deeply. And that three-sided relationship, hers, Vita's, Vanessa's, interests most of us, even as only a study in psychology. I suspect it's prurience, but it could be an interest in psychology. The examples are endless and endlessly fascinating to some. Related to our change in attitude towards sexuality is the rise of feminism over the past 5 or 6 decades or so. Quentin Bell, Virginia Woolf's nephew, probably the most authoritative writer on the subject, maintained that Bloomsbury was feminist. And in a broad sense it was. Of course, a sort of pale shade of feminism by today's standards. There was no Me Too movement then. Though none of its main female characters was a suffragette, they assumed equality with men, and on the whole, they were treated as such. Virginia herself, of course, has been taken up by feminists who've been grateful for her witty and perceptive comments in such works as A Room of One's Own, that's 1929, and 3 Guineas, 1938, in which she firmly blames the advent of war and warmongering on men. I myself continued to believe that Leonard Woolf was far more of a feminist than Virginia, but again, you'll think this is family prejudice. And since Virginia is linked so firmly to feminism, this must also help account for the extraordinary popularity of Bloomsbury. After all, there were some equally gifted, equally triangular, if you like, groups, such as the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, quite so much love intrigue to keep people occupied, but no comparable presence in the popular imagination, at least not in England and America. So, that terrible moment when the lecturer turns 2 pages over. It will therefore come as no surprise to you that in turning to my next question, who then, so not just why, but who then were the members of this group, I place Virginia Woolf at the centre of it. And this is a photograph of Virginia Woolf in 1902, 2 years before her father died. The Bloomsbury Group's icon, I believe. This is a picture by her sister, who was a very gifted painter and who had a child by Duncan Grant, which is another intriguing story that I won't tell you. And this is painted by Vanessa in 1912 in her Impressionist phase. This is painted by Vanessa in her post-Impressionist phase, which quickly followed, linked, as I'll try to show later, to the post-Impressionist exhibitions that Duncan Grant put on in 1912 and shook the art establishment to its core. You can see there how even the face, of course representation has gone by the board a long time ago, but now there isn't even a face. There is form, there's shape. It's it's progressing on from Impressionism. Also at the centre, then, is her husband, Leonard Woolf. This is Leonard in 1940, the year before Virginia died, who can in many ways be seen as the pivot of Bloomsbury. He was a founding member of the group at Cambridge, as we'll see. He was also a founding member of two other Bloomsbury Group meetings, centres rather, the 1917 Club, which unsurprisingly was founded in 1917, I think, in celebration of the Russian Revolution, and the Memoir Club in 1920, which produced many wonderful memoirs on what it was to be a member of Bloomsbury. And by marrying Virginia, Leonard made another vital contribution to the group by creating one more centre for its activities, and even more importantly, I believe, keeping her alive during those many breakdowns that she had following the terrible effort of creation that went into her novels, as well as giving her the confidence to continue her highly experimental writing, which, and I know I've said this to you before, which, since she was married to her publisher, as I am, although he no longer publishes me, I'm much too big for him now. I think he's lovely, he forgives me. But he published her when everybody else would probably have looked rather askance at her experiments, and in any case she would never have dared to experiment so freely had she not known that she could burn his dinner if he didn't publish the book. Oh, I've done that, not deliberately though. And he then published the books at the Hogarth Press, but partly the Hogarth Press was to help her through her breakdowns by giving her some kind of manual occupation. She was a lousy typesetter. I have read documents that had been typeset by Virginia, and the U's and the N's are usually upside down, which makes for rather curious reading. This is one of the early collections of her short stories, Monday or Tuesday, with woodcuts, as you can see, by her sister, Vanessa Bell. And this is Stories of the East. I thought of giving a course next year on Stories of the East. Not this book, but just, you know, wonderful texts that show how the English felt to begin with, and then how people in the East felt about the English. He also published work by other members of Bloomsbury, thus giving them a platform from which their voices might be heard. T.S. Eliot, not a bad name to start your publishing house with, but as we'll see, T.S. Eliot was not famous when he published him. Catherine Mansfield, again, not a bad second, is it? Clive Bell, his brother-in-law. Maynard Keynes, the great economist. I'll talk a little bit more about each of these. Roger Fry, E.M. Forster, Vanessa Bell, and Duncan Grant. And his list was not limited to Bloomsbury. It included, he was a very good publisher because well before anybody else had recognised the worth of these writers, he published Freud, Chekhov, Tolstoy, Rilke, Christopher Isherwood. He adds gravitas to the group. He's a serious thinker, he's a political activist, and he is a man who is solidly behind Virginia throughout her life. He was also a writer, but who would compete with Virginia? He gave up early on, he gave up writing his own novels. As you see, his short stories, but those were very early on. So far then we have one writer, one politician come publisher, and next I suggest two painters. Virginia's sister, Vanessa Bell, who couldn't look more unlike her if she tried, the rather sort of relaxed Mother Earth look that Virginia so much appreciated and envied. Vanessa, who was for Virginia always her, quote, lovely dolphin with the spangled tail, the sea blue eyes, and the heart of a fish. Cold, she found her, cold. Virginia, who believed that she was, quote, more nearly attached to Vanessa than sisters should be. Her mother had died when she was 13, and Vanessa had come to stand in partly as a support, but partly as someone she could turn all her love to. This is a painting by Vanessa, who was a very good painter in her own right, and which shows again the post-impressionist influence. Painting by Vanessa Bell of Studland Beach. You must forgive me for not talking too much about the paintings. That gives somebody in the audience a chance to give a course next year on the painters of Bloomsbury, please. With Vanessa comes her partner, at least painting partner for most of their long life together, Duncan Grant. Virginia, who detected beneath what she called his voluptuous, creamy grace a, quote, deadly tenacity of purpose, christened him, and I think this is so witty, Old Convolvulus Bed. He was always twining his way round people's affections, and I don't know whether you know this story, but on one occasion Vanessa and Virginia lent him their father's, who was dead, their father's best pair of trousers because he'd run out of trousers, and he then saw a child in difficulties in a pond nearby and dived in her father's best trousers, and they all forgave him. Such was his charm and his grace. But Duncan was more than charm. Duncan was influenced largely by Matisse, whom he includes in his post-impressionist exhibition, that wonderful sense of movement, the dancers, you know it, I know. And this is Tennis Players by Duncan Grant, 1913. So it's interesting, isn't it, to see that same effort to catch the movement. And I like this one. This is the Matisse poster, those blue cutouts, with a Bloomsbury bottle of wine and a glass in front of it, which Duncan made his own. Attached to Vanessa and Duncan at various times, for Bloomsbury's relationships are shifting and complicated, came Vanessa's husband, the art critic Clive Bell, whose main achievement, I think, was to popularise the ideas of the group's other art critic, Roger Fry, on significant form. Virginia, who became very fond of Clive despite finding him rather vain, referred to him, rather shallow, referred to him privately, as did his wife Vanessa, as the parakeet. She said he always made her think of, quote, a mixture of those two great gossipy diarists, Pepys and Boswell. With Duncan, and this is by Roger Fry, so the painting of Clive Bell is by the man he popularised, Roger Fry. With Duncan in the early stages of Bloomsbury then came the economist Maynard Keynes, which is painted by another fringe member of the group, Gwen Ravera, who was, yes, he was a Keynes, she was a Keynes, I think, linked to the Keynes, who later, and he started off by being, by deciding that he was homosexual and being very much attracted to Duncan Grant and then to Virginia's younger brother, Adrian Stephen. He then decided that he wasn't, and that he was rather in love with a Russian ballet dancer called Lydia Lopakova, who is exquisite and who adds another dimension to Bloomsbury. She introduced a lot of very beautiful dancing. They particularly liked the naked dancing on the lawn at the country house. I told you there'd be lots of sex in this lecture. Both Maynard Keynes and Duncan Grant were relatively late arrivals in the group, but the latest of all the central characters to join was, in my opinion, one of the most interesting, the art critic and painter himself, Roger Fry. Roger Fry's self-portrait, painted just before he died. A wonderful man. He never, ever, he knew so much about painting. He advised Pierpont Morgan in America on buying modern art. He knew all about the post-impressionists, and yet he never achieved great fame himself as a painter. Here's one of his oil paintings of the south of France near Cassis. And he also started the Bloomsbury Workshop in 1913 because he'd found so many artists impoverished, unable to earn a living, unable to do their work. Why don't I combine the two, he said. So you do work for me, I'll pay you, and you'll be doing your own art at the same time. And this was the Omega Workshop sign painted by Duncan Grant. And it sold what they called household goods and everyday objects. They didn't look very everyday. There were clothes, there were screens, there were lampshades, there were all sorts. Here's a room from Charleston, where a lot of the group finally settled, a room with Omega lampshades, Omega chairs, Omega tables. They didn't make the tables and the chairs, but they ordered them according to their design. Very interesting. I don't know whether you know Charleston down in Sussex, but it's very near to Virginia Woolf's country house, Monk's House, and well worth a visit. Everything that is there is painted. If it moves, paint it. If it doesn't move, if it's a panel on a door, paint it. We have a rather ugly table, and I said to my husband, I think rather fancies himself as a forger, I said, why don't you paint it? And why don't you paint a Bloomsbury design on there? So if you come to my house and I show you a Bloomsbury table, you'll know it isn't really quite the thing, although we do have one painted by Duncan Grant. Some other important writers among the group are the biographer Lytton Strachey, painted here by the woman who loved him passionately all his life, but his interests were more in younger men. Dora Carrington, wonderful picture, and Dora Carrington herself, a not dismissible painter who committed suicide after Lytton's early death in 1932. And then, of course, other writers. E.M. Forster, Passage to India, Howard's End, all those lovely novels, whom Virginia likened to a blue butterfly flitting in and out of Bloomsbury. T.S. Eliot, there he is with Virginia Woolf, to whom I'll return, and Catherine Mansfield, a New Zealand writer who was highly innovative in her field and published first her story Prelude at the Hogarth Press. So she's very definitely involved. I think Virginia felt rather competitive, but also learned quite a lot from Catherine, another person who died very young indeed of TB. And last but not least, sorry, back I go. Last but not least, as you can see, she was 6 foot without her hat on, was the flamboyant figure of Lady Ottoline Murrell. Though neither writer, painter, economist, politician or dancer, she became hostess to many of Bloomsbury's gatherings, both in Bloomsbury itself, in Bedford Square, or at her country home, Garsington, near Oxford, where she sheltered many of Bloomsbury's mainly pacifist members during First World War. Finally, 3 other founding members, scarcely remembered today, are Virginia's older brother, Toby Stephen, who died young, Desmond Mccarthy, a literary critic who never quite fulfilled the promise his friends predicted for him. You're going to be a great writer. You are a great writer, they said, but the great writing never came. Somebody once hid behind a screen at the dinner table to take down all he said, but somehow when they looked at it afterwards, it wasn't quite the great writing that they had expected. Yes, they said the same to Lytton Strachey. Whatever you get, Lytton, for your degree will never be good enough, so he promptly got a third. And then Saxon Sidney Turner, the only real musician of the group, a weird, silent creature whom Virginia likened to the aloe plant that flowers, well, so she says, but you know what an imaginative person she is, but the flowers every 100 years. I'd like somebody to tell me whether that is true or not. And when did all this take place? As I see it, the group started to form in 1899, when most of its male members met at Cambridge University, though ardent feminists would place its origins only later, in 1904, when female members joined it. The majority of the men attended Trinity College, Cambridge, at the turn of the century, where they met at such elite clubs as the Apostles and the Midnight Society. These included Leonard Woolf, Lytton Strachey, Clive Bell, Toby Stephen, of course Virginia's brother, she was born Virginia Stephen, and Saxon Sidney Turner. Other members, Desmond McCarthy, Maynard Keynes, Roger Fry, and E.M. Forster, were also Cambridge graduates, but joined the group later. You can probably see where the charge of elitism comes from. Only Duncan Grant wasn't at Cambridge among the British male members, and he was at an art college. One of the most important influences on these impressionable young men were the Cambridge philosophers, J.E. McTaggart, A.N. Whitehead, Bertrand Russell. As I said to you, most of Bloomsbury were pacifist, and Russell led the way, and G.E. Moore, the philosopher. The Oxford English Dictionary actually defines Bloomsbury as an association, quote, based on friendship and interest in the arts, which derived its philosophy from the central passage, this is the Oxford Dictionary, of G.E. Moore's Principia Ethica, the Principles of Ethics. By far the most valuable things, Moore wrote, are the pleasures of human intercourse and the enjoyment of beautiful objects. It is they that form the rational ultimate end of social progress. Moore and his fellow philosophers, most of whom were fellows of Trinity, encouraged their students to believe in the power of reason and love, which could be found in the study of beauty and truth. Now, this may not sound very revolutionary to us today, but in its own day it was regarded as very dangerous, a dangerous rejection of established morals, conventions, and established wisdom. What had beauty got to do with it? What had friendship got to do with it? This rigorous questioning of established truths is amusingly summed up in the opening passage of a novel by E.M. Forster. You may have read it, himself at Cambridge, as you remember. The novel is called The Longest Journey, and the first section is called Cambridge. I won't read all of it, but you've got the extract too on your handout. And they're discussing objectivity and subjectivity. "The cow is there," said Ansel, lighting a match and holding it out over the carpet. No one spoke. He waited till the end of the match fell off. Then he said again, "She is there, the cow, there, now." "You have not proved it," said a voice. "I have proved it to myself." "I have proved to myself that she isn't," said the voice. "The cow is not there." Ansel frowned and lit another match. "She's there for me," he declared. "I don't care whether she's there for you or not. Whether I'm in Cambridge or Iceland or dead, the cow will be there." It was philosophy. They were discussing the existence of objects. Do they exist only when there is someone to look at them, or have they a real existence of their own? It is all very interesting, but at the same time difficult. Hence the cow. She seemed to make things easier. She was so familiar, so solid that surely the truths that she illustrated would in time become familiar and solid also. Is the cow there or not? This was better than deciding between objectivity and subjectivity. So at Oxford, just at the same time, one was asking, what do our rooms look like in the back? And I think it's an amusing illustration of the kind of interest they had in these philosophical points that maybe, I'm sure that Virginia and Vanessa would have been just as interested. The next phase then was when they joined the two young women, who rather shocked them, as you'll see. 1904, Toby Stephen, and 1903 and 1904, Toby Stephen, the brother of Virginia, and his friends left Cambridge and were reunited mainly in London, where the female element entered the group. And with it, as one might expect, a slight change in attitude and theory. Women have always had a good influence, you know. When Toby's father, the well-known man of letters, Sir Leslie Stephen, died in 1904, his children, Toby, Vanessa, Virginia and Adrian, in age of birth, moved from their highly respectable family home at 22 Hyde Park Gate, Kensington, to an almost disreputable flat, or house rather, at 46 Gordon Square, which henceforth became, as Tyrrell mentioned, the centre of Bloomsbury. That's where Virginia lived, and she loved it. She saw the move from stuffy old, respectable South Kensington to rather disreputable Bloomsbury as a transition, quote, from tyranny to freedom. Bloomsbury was a place where students from London University and the Slade School of Art took lodgings, not to mention artists' models and other dubious types. The convenience of the Slade may have influenced, of course, Vanessa's decision, as well as the even more practical aspect of very low rents. Virginia described her new home in glowing detail. This is extract 3, and I won't read all of it. To begin with, she writes, and I think this is something to do with the essence of Bloomsbury, this feeling of moving from tyranny, the tyranny of the Victorian age perhaps, because she died in 1901, Queen Victoria, to the freedom of a looser approach to life. To begin with, Virginia writes, it was astonishing to stand at the drawing room window and look into all those trees. She'd been in a very narrow cul-de-sac where she could actually see her neighbour's house, window and more, as you'll see. Instead of looking at old Mrs. Redgrave washing her neck across the way. So here, she says, she's looking out onto the trees of Gordon Square. The light and air after the rich red gloom of Hyde Park Gate were a revelation. Things one had never seen in the darkness there, Watts' pictures, Dutch cabinets, blue china, shone out for the first time in the drawing room at Gordon Square. After the muffled silence of Hyde Park Gate, the roar of traffic was positively alarming. Odd characters, sinister and strange, prowled and slunk past our window. But what was even more exhilarating was the extraordinary increase of space. And so she goes on, and she ends that passage, and I'm sure we can identify that feeling we had when as students we moved out into our own space. We were full of experiments and reforms. We were going to do without table napkins. We were going to paint, to write, to have coffee after dinner instead of tea at 9. Everything was going to be new. Everything was going to be different. Everything was on trial. I think that's a very good expression of what Bloomsbury felt it stood for when it started. Toby's friends, who had already started visiting him in London, naturally continued to do so in his new and freer home. Generally for cocoa and buns, although my husband assures me that there was the occasional bottle of whiskey floating round, which means that there was probably always whiskey floating around. It was here that they got to know Toby's two sisters, Vanessa and Virginia. And as Duncan Grant wrote, These apostolic young men found to their amazement that they could be shocked by the boldness and scepticism of two young women. For as Vanessa admitted, we did not hesitate to talk of anything. This was literally true. You could say anything that you liked about art or sex or religion. You could also talk freely and very likely dully about the ordinary doings of everyday life. There was very little self-consciousness, I think, in these early gatherings, but life was exciting, terrible, and amusing, and one had to explore it, thankful that one could do so freely. You notice that word freedom again. Conditions in Bloomsbury changed again in 1906 when Toby Stephen died suddenly of typhoid, and his sister Vanessa, who had initially rejected Clive Bell, accepted him, probably as a kind of security, a comfort against that terrible loss. He was one of her brother's friends, and Virginia and Adrian moved out to 29 Fitzroy Square, thus creating two centres for Bloomsbury and two evenings at home. Virginia and Adrian had to compete, and they had a Friday night. But by this time, Bloomsbury was not a well-known group. Its members had done little to make themselves known to the outside world by 1910. Neither of the writers, Virginia or Lytton Strachey, had produced very much by that point. But in 1910 came the first of these rather impressive demonstrations that Bloomsbury was out to shock. Épater la bourgeoisie. But and that was Roger Fry's first post-impressionist exhibition. So I'm sorry I can't spend time telling you about the reactions of the audience. One very large, very overweight, very red gentleman, oozing the last undercut of well-done or underdone beef, yes, as Leonard put it, was absolutely, he almost had an apoplexy on the spot. And Fry's second post-impressionist exhibition in 1912 added to the outcry and the outrage, as did Lytton Strachey's equally iconoclastic Eminent Victorians in 1918. And this book, which made Lytton famous, and again redounded on Bloomsbury in a way, was a deliberate departure from the heavy Victorian life and letters hagiography. In this collection of sketches, Strachey sets out to do the opposite. That is, to demythify famous Victorian figures who had become legends, saintly legends, in their lifetime. Florence Nightingale, they're all still alive, I think. No, perhaps not Gordon of Khartoum. Well, certainly Florence Nightingale was still alive. Gordon of Khartoum, Arnold of Rugby, or was she? Arnold of Rugby and Cardinal Manning. Cardinal Newman apparently escapes relatively unscathed. Who knew, for example, and this is part of the demythifying process, who knew, for example, that Florence Nightingale had a rather bad temper? That would never have come in to the Victorian biography. If Strachey's intention was to shock the British public into an awareness of the real truth behind the myths, he certainly succeeded. Vanessa Bell believed that the honesty of mind and hatred of sham displayed in Eminent Victorians was of great benefit to Bloomsbury at this relatively early stage in its development. Equally shocking in its own way was the publication of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland only 5 years later in 1923, early 1923. Eliot was by this time himself associated with Bloomsbury, and the group benefited from this further publicity. Of course, T.S. Eliot is deservedly one of the best known, if not the best known poet of the 20th century, and we're very lucky to be able to include him in this eminent group. And we can do so by virtue of the fact, not just that he knew people there, but the fact that two of his earliest, most significant works were published by Leonard's press, the Hogarth Press, and T.S. Eliot himself became and was a fringe member of the group. Despite being born to a Unitarian family in St. Louis, Mississippi, in 1888, and educated at Harvard and the Sorbonne, T.S. Eliot chose to settle in England in 1914. He would become a member of the Church of England, as you may know, in 1927, and a naturalised British subject the same year, so he makes his choice of Britain quite clear. When Leonard first met Eliot in 1917, he was not yet an established poet, having had only Prufrock and other poems published in the Egoist Press that same year. Eliot was still working at Lloyd's Bank, though he also helped run the Egoist magazine in his spare time. And there was something of the bank clerk about him, Leonard felt, with his precise, rather formal, cautious, even inhibited manner. Virginia, who met him a year later when he first visited Hogarth House, where they were living in Richmond, found him, quote, a polished, cultivated, elaborate young American, talking so slow that each word seemed to have a special finish allotted to it. She also called him, or described him, as tight and shiny as a woodlouse. She could never resist. Beneath the surface, however, she saw that he was, quote, very intellectual, intolerant, with strong views of his own and a poetic creed, unquote. She never changed her mind about the force of Eliot's intellect, though she did begin to find him far less formal and pedantic as she got to know him. The ice was broken during a weekend he spent at their country house, which they all three thoroughly enjoyed. Tom, as they called him, was grateful to them for publishing 7 of his poems in 1919, when he was virtually unknown. They're just called Poems, 1919. They also went on to publish the first edition in English of his most famous work, The Wasteland, in 1923. I mean, that really is quite remarkable prescience on the part of Leonard and Virginia. But when Leonard and Virginia first met Eliot in 1917, well, Virginia in 1918 actually, they had already recognised in him a fellow iconoclast, someone ready to break all the I was going to say break all the sacred cows, but I'm getting a bit mixed up there. Break all the sacred objects. Get rid of them, clear the way. But they did recognise someone who was questioning in poetry many of its accepted conventions and defying them, as Virginia was starting to do in the novel. Eliot himself reminds us that the situation of poetry when he started writing himself in the early 20th century was, quote, stagnant to a degree difficult for any young poet later in the century to understand, and he tried to bring it back to life in various ways. Many of them, he claimed, learnt from his fellow American poet Ezra Pound. He became aware, for instance, of the importance of adapting metre to mood, which involved, and this is where the real importance comes, of course, involved a willingness to depart from the traditional verse forms of the 19th century. The free verse, vers libre, of the late 19th and early 20th French symbolist poets such as Verlaine, Laforgue, Mallarmé particularly attracted him. Like them, he aimed to make his verse more definite and concrete, that's his words, by always having a definite emotion behind it. So instead of just talking flowerily about the landscape, he would try to describe something very precisely, perhaps in the way that those men at Cambridge were trying to define their feelings also through philosophy. In this, he was also influenced by a group of poets who had gathered round Pound in London in 1912, the so-called Imagists, which included Richard Aldington and Hilda Doolittle. According to the Imagists, everything was to be expressed through the image and cadence, that is, by appealing to the physical ear and the mind's eye, and through them to the auditory and visual imagination. There was to be no dilution of these appeals by resorting to the language of discourse. So there's no explanation. You're just presented with an emotion which is conjured up by either a sound or a visual image. I thought I'd just read you here a little bit of Prufrock. I Grow Old. I mean, it's a section, I haven't got it down, so don't worry about it. It's a section in which he's trying to put into words his own feelings about growing old and feeling rather washed up. And he expresses it not by saying it, but by giving us some examples. I grow old, I grow old. I shall wear the bottoms of my trousers rolled. Shall I part my hair behind? Do I dare to eat a peach? I shall wear white flannel trousers and walk upon the beach. I have heard the mermaids singing each to each. I do not think that they will sing to me. And although that last reference is puzzling, it's an allusion to a way of life in which there is lyricism and joy. The fact that he's old and I do not think that they will sing to me, of course, being particularly significant. And from his time at Harvard, and I think that's partly the influence of the Imagists on his verse, and from this time, his time at Harvard University, 1906 to 1909, where he studied philosophy, Eliot also learnt to fear romantic softness, though his own poetry I find wonderfully lyrical. I think that's quite a lyrical passage about the old man walking on the beach. I mean, think of the phrases from some of his most famous poems, like The Wasteland, The Hyacinth Girl, The Violet Hour. Isn't that a wonderful description of twilight? The Violet Hour, The Rose Garden, and all that implies. That's in Burnt Norton. Most challenging of T.S. Eliot's beliefs, however, and the one which distinguishes him most sharply from his 19th century predecessors and puts him most firmly, for me, in the Bloomsbury group of people desiring to shock, is the need for allusiveness, allusion to a wide variety of other literatures and cultures, often the metaphysical poets of the 17th century. And he explains this in a way which made me see why it is that he does such a difficult thing. I mean, that passage I've just read, I have heard the mermaid singing, is from a poem by John Donne. Well, if you don't know it, does the poem mean anything to you? Eliot writes, our civilization comprehends great variety and complexity. And this variety and complexity, playing upon a refined sensibility, must produce various and complex results. The poet must become more and more comprehensive, more elusive, more indirect, to force, to dislocate, if necessary, language into his meaning. Hope that doesn't sound too terrifying. It's clear from the start that Eliot intends to put into practice what he had learned for himself and later from Pound and the Imagists. And there is abundant evidence of this in his first and early volume, Prufrock and Other Observations, of his respect for the clear, precise image. Think of the opening of that poem. I mean, I can't talk much about Eliot, so don't worry. I won't go on about Eliot forever, but I think it's a lovely poem and a very evocative one. And think of the opening of that passage, of the poem. Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky like a patient etherized upon a table. Let us go through certain half-deserted streets, the muttering retreats of restless nights in one-night cheap hotels and sawdust restaurants with oyster shells, streets that follow like a tedious argument of insidious intent to lead you to an overwhelming question. Oh, do not ask, what is it? Let us go and make our visit. In the room, the women come and go, talking of Michelangelo. The yellow fog that rubs its back upon the window pane, the yellow smoke that rubs its muzzle on the window panes, licked its tongue into the corners of the evening, lingered upon the pools that stand in drains, let fall upon its back the soot that falls from chimneys, slipped by the terrace, made a sudden leap, and seeing that it was a soft October night, curled once about the house and fell asleep. I mean, you know, how would you describe the sky? Like a patient etherized upon a table? Extraordinary poetry. You will notice here the colloquial tone, almost as if the narrator is having a conversation with you. Let us go then, you and I. But also a sense of terror. Oh, do not ask, what is it? Apprehension, which Eliot had found both in the French symbolist poets and the English metaphysicals, a combination which runs right through Prufrock and right through his poems. In Prufrock, he creates a persona, in this case, a timid, apprehensive, socially gauche little man, and balding too, who fears he does not know quite what. So he's fearful of what? And this is the last bit that I will read from Eliot, and then I'm going to give you a break. And indeed, Prufrock says, and indeed there will be time to wonder, do I dare, and do I dare? Time to turn back and descend the stair with a bald spot in the middle of my hair. They will say how his hair is growing thin. My morning coat, my collar mounting firmly to the chin, my necktie rich and modest but asserted by a simple pin. They will say, but how his arms and legs are thin. Do I dare disturb the universe? In a minute, there is time for decisions and revisions, which a minute will reverse. This fear will permeate Eliot's more famous work, The Wasteland, just as Prufrock's content will. That is, it will also give an even fuller but equally disquieting picture of contemporary society from the top, those society ladies talking of Michelangelo, to the bottom, the men standing in shirt sleeves, smoking at the window. But it's Eliot's deliberate elimination of all merely connective and transitional passages which caused and still causes readers difficulties. It's a fascinating poem, and I may be wrong to suggest it's about a little man who's frightened to propose to the lady he thinks he ought to marry. Now, I'm going to stop there for a break, I think what they don't call a lavatory break, but it is, and then I'm going to go back to the Bloomsbury Group and talk about what it was about, what values they stood for. Thank you very much.
Yes? They published Wasteland because I heard a tale that Wasteland made its impact because of the way it was edited.
Yes. Oh, that was by Pound. But they did publish the Wasteland, in
And it was
1923.
So
It was
you
pound,
confirm that?
yes.
Would you like me to sort of protect you and you go up for a minute? Because otherwise you may get lots of people coming to try to clip you.
I don't mind. Like the Speaker in the House of Commons. Right, so I thought we would come back to that last question. What did they stand for? What is it exactly that distinguishes Bloomsbury from other artistic multicultural groups? To their critics, and there were quite a few, Bloomsbury represented all that was most elitist in art and life. D.A. Moody, for instance, defined them almost solely in terms of elitism. They had the requisite residue of Hebraic conscience, expressed mostly in righteous scorn for the barbarian, Philistine, and populace to which all outsiders were consigned, he said. Well, he obviously feels like one of the outsiders, doesn't he? And the establishment art critic, John Rothenstein, Sir John Rothenstein, saw them not so much as an artistic as a criminal association. But as Quentin Bell argues, no one who knew Bloomsbury at all well, whether they liked or disliked it, will accept this picture of an intellectual mafia. I suppose the painters help deflect that criticism of being wholly intellectual. Sir John, Bell writes about Bloomsbury as though it were the Communist Party, the Society of Jesus, or the Carbonari. Quote, a closely knit association with canons, a party line, and a leader. In fact, it was less organised, less ideologically homogeneous than the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, the Souls, or even the Impressionists. It had no form of membership, no rules, no leaders. It can hardly be said to have had any common ideas about art, literature, or politics. I do think he's going a little bit too far there. And although it had, I believe, a common attitude to life and was united by friendships, it was as amorphous a body as a group of friends can be. Quentin's father, Clive Bell, an actual member of the group, as you know, is even more sceptical about the possibility of defining its characteristics. In his autobiography, Old Friends, he expresses uncertainty as to, quote, whether what the chatterers were chattering about, i.e. Bloomsbury, was a point of view, a period, a gang of conspirators, or an infectious disease. The problem with all these definitions is, as Quentin Bell points out, that they could equally well apply to other groups, like the Pre-Raphaelites, for example, or the Souls. Is there then anything that could be seen as more exclusive Bloomsbury? I mean, do we mean anything, or are we just referring to a group of friends who give us some good stories to gossip about? If forced to summarise Bloomsbury characteristics myself, I would say that this mixed group of writers, painters, critics, politicians shared, among other things, a belief in reason, not always carried out, a certain sensitiveness towards life, a love of beauty, certainly, whatever form that took, a faith in friendship, and a commitment to complete frankness, again, not always carried out. You know the story of Vanessa's daughter, Angelica, who went through most of her adult life believing, or her early adult life believing, that she was the son of her the daughter of, thank you, the daughter of her putative father, Clive Bell. She was, in fact, Duncan Grant's daughter. Vanessa thought that if she had a daughter by a painter, she'd have a painter daughter. She did. Quite theoretical about it. And the other quality, of course, that I have tried to bring out already, that they shared, was a desire to shock and be different, probably their most distinctive feature. Lytton Strachey, for example, on one memorable occasion, which is related with great relish by Quentin, when Queen Victoria and her rather prudish Victorian age still dominated British life despite her death in 1901, Lytton Strachey, a young undergraduate who didn't know these two young ladies at Gordon Square very well, Lytton Strachey, seeing a stain on Vanessa Bell's white dress, asked dramatically, "Semen?" It was not, at the time, the kind of remark you were supposed to address to a young woman, not a respectable young woman. It is this aspect of Bloomsbury that Clive Bell emphasises, writing of his contemporaries that they shared a contempt for conventional ways of thinking and feeling, contempt for conventional morals. His son Quentin adds that it was the degree to which Bloomsbury despised the conventions which distinguished it from other groups. One significant example of Bloomsbury's rejection of established conventions is in its enthusiastic support of those two post-impressionist exhibitions. Indeed, two of its members, Duncan Grant and Vanessa Bell, appeared in the second of these shows, which shocked both public and art establishment alike. When I wrote about Isaac Rosenberg, for example, he was at the Slade School of Art, and he remembered how the tutors there would try to persuade their students not to go to these post-impressionist exhibitions. The Slade prided itself on being ahead of the time, and of course had only got as far as Impressionism, and they were very cross indeed when Roger Fry arrived with post-impressionism to shake them all up again. And as if these post-impressionist exhibitions were not in themselves a shocking enough challenge to the assumptions of the day, when the second of these closed with a ball to celebrate the event, the female members of Bloomsbury chose to shock even further. In an age when even the ankle was only just becoming visible, the ladies of Bloomsbury and their younger friends from the Slade decided to honour the occasion by disguising themselves as Tahitians, Tahitian women. Gauguin had been one of the revelations of the exhibition. If you look at Gauguin's paintings, you wonder which part of the costume they decided to copy, whether they really were. Some of the older ladies at the ball actually walked out in disgust. And unfortunately, there are no photographs. I'm terribly disappointed. Even the rather enlightened Roger Fry uttered a mild protest. For Virginia Woolf in particular, Bloomsbury was indeed an escape from a stuffy and suffocating world. Both Clive and Quentin Bell make much of Bloomsbury's rejection of sexual taboos, but even more importantly, in my opinion, was its rejection of established conventions in the arts. which had a profound effect on both the writers and painters of the group. And you remember, if you think of any of these writers or painters, they all were modernists to a large extent. Virginia Woolf herself, and I'll talk about her a little in a moment, Lytton Strachey, T.S. Eliot, Catherine Mansfield, E.M. Forster, Vanessa Bell, Duncan Grant, Roger Fry, none of them could be called traditional or conventional. Well, not at the time. It might be fairer to describe Virginia, among others, as questioning rather than despising conventions, but she certainly questioned them. On a more obvious level, Bloomsbury also influenced Virginia and its other members by providing those members with an enormously secure social environment within which to operate. I mean, if you're going to experiment, it's always rather comforting to know that you're surrounded by people who will at least try to understand what you're experimenting about. For all the members of this group had either class or money, as I've mentioned, and in some cases both. And if they didn't have actual class by the time they left Cambridge, they were part of an intellectual elite. In addition, a number of Bloomsburys happened to be book or art critics and reviewers, so that members could count on each other to give them the benefit of the doubt and to try to understand their experiments. I wish I had lots of friends who were reviewers. My husband comforts me. He says, but at least you know they're not doing it just to be nice to you when they write a nice. I said I'd rather they were just nice, actually. In Virginia Woolf's case, she also had a publisher husband, which increased her sense of freedom. There's no doubt in my mind that the Bloomsbury Group had an important influence on her development as a writer by encouraging that desire to experiment, to try out new ideas, to get rid of what had been such a suffocating form for her when she started. And that basically feminist attitude, which I described to you, all part of their rejection of 19th century assumptions, I've already mentioned, which encouraged her, again, to pursue her own ideas. And Woolf's confidence was, of course, increased by the enormously secure social environment, as were all the other members. But possibly the most important factor in Bloomsbury's makeup, as far as her work was concerned, seems to me the presence of artists and art critics in the group as well as writers, and this cross-fertilization that was going on, most of them even more adventurous. And as the art world generally was in the early 20th century by comparison with the literary establishment, there were still a lot of very traditional writers, but the artists had zoomed ahead of them on the whole. From an early age, Virginia had been exposed through Vanessa Bell, her sister, to the highly innovative theories which were rocking the art world to its foundations, theories enthusiastically embraced by Virginia's brother-in-law, Clive Bell, and the other art critic, Duncan Grant, and the painter, Duncan Grant, as well as Roger Fry. Virginia, and I thought this was very interesting indeed, a comment that made by her nephew, Virginia's nephew, Quentin Bell. Virginia sat to Vanessa a number of times, as you saw, and more than that actually, and was intrigued by her willingness to work with what she called gaps, elisions, and silences. So not always filling in with a nice, regular, chronological story. But it was Roger Fry, one of the last members to join in 1910, who exerted the greatest and most revolutionary influence both on the painters and on Woolf herself. She even remembered Fry saying at the time he shocked the public with that post-impressionist exhibition that literature was suffering. This is what Fry said. Literature was suffering from a plethora of old clothes. Cézanne and Picasso had shown the way. Writers should fling representation to the winds and follow suit. And later on, not too much later on, I'll read you a passage from Mrs. Dalloway, which I think shows her doing exactly that. It's almost as though she's painting an impressionist picture. Virginia had announced as early as 1908, that's 2 years before the first post-impressionist exhibition, so I mustn't attribute it all to Roger Fry. She had announced in 1908, "I shall reform the novel." But I think it was her exposure to Fry's theories which helped her to make that a reality. His charm and his intelligence in expounding them, of course, helped her to accept what he was saying. Fry's contribution to Bloomsbury attitude to both the visual arts and the arts in general cannot be exaggerated. Tolstoy's idea of the value of art as a vehicle for transmitting emotion is something he uses in his arguments. The value of art as a vehicle for transmitting emotion. And going on to prune Tolstoy's theories of their moral implications, because, as you know, Tolstoy became more and more moral and religious and gave up writing novels that were without some kind of moral towards the end, and which Tolstoy valued according to the reaction they produced in actual life. Did they improve people? Did they give a moral picture of life? So those emotions Fry values in and for themselves. He sees art as a means to a new reality and not a reflection of ordinary reality. As such, it's freed from both moral encumbrances and the necessity of representational accuracy. Even the most superficial reading of Woolf's work shows how closely she followed this line. Well, of course, if I said to you what he's talking about is art for art's sake, that is to oversimplify, but that basically is what he's saying. We must not expect a message of a very obvious kind or a very moral kind, art for art's sake. It is a creed which places more value on form than content, and which leads Fry to his theory of significant form, although the actual phrase was coined by Clive Bell. Take, for example, Virginia's portrayal of a typical summer's day in London in the early 1920s in Mrs. Dalloway. Her descriptions are highly eclectic and chosen, I suggest, with an eye. It isn't in your sheets, I'm afraid. I'd written it by hand and I could not bear to write it out again. It's highly eclectic and chosen with an eye to overall form of the book, I believe, rather than for purposes of representational accuracy. This is the passage. Some of you will know it. Bond Street fascinated her. Bond Street early in the morning in the season, its flags flying, its shops, no splash, no glitter, one roll of tweed in the shop where her father had bought his suits for 50 years. A few pearls. Is it in there or not? Oh, it is in there. Oh, good. Number 7. Okay, number 7. I'll start again. Bond Street fascinated her. Bond Street early in the morning in the season, its flags flying, its shops, no splash, no glitter, one roll of tweed in the shop where her father had bought his suits for 50 years, a few pearls, salmon on an ice block. That is all, she said, looking at the fishmongers. That is all, she repeated, pausing for a moment at the window of a glove shop, where, before the war, you could buy almost perfect gloves. And her old Uncle William used to say a lady is known by her shoes and her gloves. He had turned on his bed one morning in the middle of the war. He had said, I have had enough. Gloves and shoes. She had a passion for gloves. But her own daughter, her Elizabeth, cared not a straw for either of them. Not a straw, she thought, going on up Bond Street to a shop where they kept flowers for her when she gave a party. Well, if you want to know what London really looked like in the early 1920s, don't read Virginia Woolf. But if you want to know how it felt, and I mean the privilege, the exquisite taste of Bond Street, I think, is present in that passage. If you want to know how it felt, then she's your writer. The point of the description of Bond Street is not, of course, representational. Clarissa must be seen in her appropriate setting, partly so that the reader can make the contrast with Septimus, a war-damaged veteran, when he appears on the scene, fresh from a far less privileged lodging off the Tottenham Court Road. But more than that, this so-called description of Bond Street is a means of furthering the book's form, with the apparently casual introduction of Elizabeth, her daughter. At the end of the passage, another dimension is skillfully added to the picture. And with the reference to her party, we're kept in mind of one of the main shaping devices of the book, which is, of course, that everything and all the characters will lead up, even the dead Septimus, dead by that time of suicide, because he's been damaged in the war and can't bear to go on living. Even the dead Septimus will be present in the mouth of that appalling psychiatrist, Sir William Bradshaw. By the time Virginia wrote Mrs. Dalloway in the 1920s, therefore, she might well have echoed Fry's statement to his friend Lowes Dickinson in 1913, "I have been attacking poetry to understand painting." So the shape of the poetry, the attention to theme in poetry. And I'm developing a theory that content is merely directive of form with no separate value at all, and that all the essential quality has to do with pure form. So when you look at the book, often something that you don't find terribly relevant at that moment will come and will help to flesh out the book and its form. But by quoting Mrs. Dalloway, I'm jumping ahead of myself. Virginia's discovery of new literary techniques to match those that had excited the artists and art critics of Bloomsbury was not immediate, as the work preceding Mrs. Dalloway would show. Though she would eventually reject accepted conventions concerning plot and character in particular, and replace them with a roving consciousness capable of dealing with the myriad impressions. You saw all the impressions that Clarissa has. Where does her uncle come into it? He's popped into her head because she's looking in a glove shop and she remembers what he says. It's just the way our mind works, isn't it? What has become known in that William James phrase as her stream of consciousness technique. But her first two novels were fairly traditional in both form and technique, though both also show signs of slight rebellion. The first one, which is the description of it's called The Voyage Out, 1915, has a well-defined plot along 19th century lines. Mr. and Mrs. Vinrace are sailing out on a cruise to South America in Captain Vinrace's. Mr. and Mrs. Ambrose are sailing out in Captain Vinrace's ship, on which we also meet the Vinrace's daughter, Rachel, and there is, at the end, there's some love interest. But the novel doesn't end conventionally. Virginia can't quite bring herself to give you that happy 19th century Jane Austen ending with people happily marrying and Rachel dies of a mysterious disease. I've spoilt it for you. By her second novel, Night and Day, which I think is a very clear description of Virginia's meeting with her future husband, Leonard Woolf, and this is Night and Day in 1919, it's even clearer that Woolf is groping for some better way of expressing her ideas and vision of life. Though the book itself is not startlingly experimental, there are some very good sort of pre-stream of consciousness novels, precursors to those. And in her third novel, we begin to see more clearly what she's up to. Jacob's Room, 1922, Woolf breaks violently away from the novel's traditions. She had been experimenting in a series of short stories. Do you remember? We'll get there. Monday or Tuesday. And stories like The Mark on the Wall, Kew Gardens, and Monday or Tuesday. There is, in Jacob's Room in 1922, 3 years before Mrs. Dalloway, hardly any action, story, or character as such. The main emphasis is on style and form, as it is in most poetry, and like the poet, Virginia relies heavily on imagery to link different parts together and shape her material. She uses Jacob's Room itself to discuss one of her main sources of discontent with the novel. She's been reading people like Dickens, which those of you who attended my course possibly read too. And although it's comforting to be given a very precise representational image of the character, their clothes, their hair, their eyes, perhaps their voice, she's not happy with this. She thinks it's not how we see things. The impossibility of finding satisfaction in characterization of the traditional kind emerges very clearly then in this third novel. In one scene, for example, where her eponymous figure, Jacob, is travelling up to Cambridge by train, she describes the reaction of a middle-aged lady in the same railway carriage who is going to visit her son there. But Virginia ends the scene, as you'll see in Extract 8, she ends the scene by expressing dissatisfaction with the woman's report. Now, you must know this scene. Haven't you sat in a tube or a train or a bus looking at the person opposite you, and you know that person? You know what they're like. I mean, look at the way their lip curls, or look at the clothes they're wearing. Of course we don't. Of course we don't. Because as Virginia writes in that passage, nobody sees anyone as he is, let alone an elderly lady sitting opposite a strange young man in a railway carriage. They see a whole, they see all sorts of things, they see themselves. And then finally, one must do the best one can with her report. Well, this is a long way from the novelist telling you what his character is like, what his character has, almost for breakfast, how his character dresses. All we know about Jacob is that his socks, I think, are rather baggy. And one must do the best one can, she says, with her report. And this is Virginia talking about her old lady. Anyhow, this was Jacob Flanders, aged 19. It is no use trying to sum people up. One must follow hints, not exactly what is said, nor entirely what is done. And of course, for some people, that's very aggravating and very irresponsible. Of course, you're supposed to tell me what this person is like. What are you doing? Why are you writing a novel? So instead of trying to sum people up, Jacob in particular, Virginia follows him in a series of scenes from his childhood to his death in the First World War. This is written in 1922. Virginia herself had a breakdown which lasted from 1912 right through to 1917. So for most of the war, she has been in the charge of psychiatric nurses and has not been really participating in all that the war involved. And all her books after that, for at least the next three, are in some way involved with that war. He ends by being killed in the First World War, and the only way we get to know him is by the comments of his family, his mother, and his friends, including the prostitute he once slept with. I must keep up the sex content in this lecture. The form of the novel is then loosely chronological, as we follow Jacob from birth to death, though with other related scenes interspersed. But the real shape of the book is the empty space at the centre of it, where we, the reader, create Jacob for ourselves. We take away from each of these mini scenes of his life as he's growing up some impression which we ourselves turn into a character. Shortly after finishing Jacob's Room, Virginia tries to explain more clearly her misgivings about not just traditional novelists in the 19th century, such as Dickens and Thackeray, but also about her more immediate predecessors, such as Arnold Bennett, whom I personally find a wonderful novelist. Have you read The Old Wives' Tale? Marvellous, marvellous book. Arnold Bennett, H.G. Wells, John Galsworthy. And in her essay, Mr. Bennett and Mrs. Brown, published in 1923, she says what she finds dissatisfying about them. Whilst attacking the so-called realism of Bennett and his peers, whom she dubs Edwardians, she advocates a more fluid internal approach to the problem of characterization and other aspects of the novel, which she and her fellow modernizers, James Joyce, D.H. Lawrence, whom she dubs Georgians, are turning to. But her position is best expressed for me, and I won't read you the whole passage by any means, but it's beautifully put in an essay she called Modern Fiction. Both what she objects to in the traditional novel and what she wants to achieve in her own novels. And I'll read you just the first part of it. Admitting the vagueness, extract 9, admitting the vagueness which afflicts all criticism of the novels, let us hazard the opinion that for us at this moment the form of fiction most in vogue often misses than secures the thing we seek. Whether we call it, and this is a wonderful comment on what she's trying to achieve in her novels, what is she looking for? What is she trying to convey to you? Certainly not representational. Whether we call it life or spirit, truth or reality, this, the essential thing, has moved off or on and refuses to be contained any longer in such ill-fitting vestments as we provide. Nevertheless, we go on perseveringly, conscientiously constructing our 32 chapters, after a design which more and more ceases to resemble the vision in our mind. So she is after the expression of a vision of some aspect of life which she wants to convey to us. So much of the enormous labour of providing the solidity, the likeness to life of the story is not merely labour thrown away, but labour misplaced to the extent of obscuring and blotting out the light of conception. The writer seems constrained not only by his own free will, but by some powerful and unscrupulous tyrant who has him in thrall to provide a plot, to provide comedy, tragedy, love, interest, and an air of probability, embalming the whole so impeccably that if all his figures were to come to life, they would find themselves dressed down to the last button of their coats in the fashion of the hour. The tyrant is obeyed. The novel is done to a turn. Sounds like a cake in an oven, doesn't it? But sometimes, more and more often as time goes by, we suspect a momentary doubt, a spasm of rebellion. She's talking about herself, of course, as the pages fill themselves in the customary way. Is life like this? Must novels be like this? Look within, she says, and life, it seems, is very far from being like this. Examine for a moment an ordinary mind on an ordinary day. Well, examine your own. Not that I'm calling you ordinary, of course. Well, my mind is, and I know what she means. The mind receives a myriad impressions, trivial, fantastic, evanescent, or engraved with the sharpness of steel. And so it goes on, and it's a wonderful passage, and you can read all of it for yourselves afterwards. But this is what she wants to achieve. And in Mrs. Dalloway, I think, for the first time, she feels, and mostly the critics feel, that she has achieved it. An ordinary mind on an ordinary day is perhaps what Virginia had in mind when she created Clarissa, though to most of us she's a rather privileged lady and not at all ordinary. But don't forget, this is the 1920s. Virginia knew such people, and they were fairly familiar of her life. But this novel, in its attempts to recreate, in Virginia's own words that I've just read, life or spirit, truth or reality, must surely be about more than Clarissa's party. So to balance this view of things, Virginia adds another darker, but oddly exciting to her at times, side, in the person of the young, and it's part of her own existence, of course, madness, but she adds it in the person of the young, less socially privileged Septimus Smith, who has returned shell-shocked from the First World War and whose mind has remained unhinged by the experience. As she writes in her diary on October the 14th, 1922, Mrs. Dalloway has branched into a book, that is, from a short story she started called The Prime Minister. And I adumbrate here a study, and this is what she wants the book to be about, a study of insanity and suicide. The world seen by the sane and the insane, side by side. And don't forget, she has just emerged from a prolonged period of insanity herself. Something like that, she says. Septimus Smith, is that a good name? And to be more close to the fact than Jacob. But I think Jacob was a necessary step for me in working free. The plot of Mrs. Dalloway, and I can't talk about it in any detail, is very slight, even slighter than Jacob's room. Clarissa spends her day preparing for her party, and Septimus spends his day visiting the psychiatrist Sir William Bradshaw, being visited by his local doctor, Dr. Holmes, who says he must go into a home because he's clearly mentally disturbed, and throwing himself onto the spiked railings of his lodging house in preference to being incarcerated in a home. And of course only Virginia's own privilege and money prevented her suffering the same fate, because, if Leonard hadn't had money to have nurses at home to look after her, she would certainly, once you threatened suicide, you were deemed to be unsafe and had to go into a home. The two strands of the plot, Clarissa and then the young man, are linked together loosely through various incidents and people, as we see, and the action is limited to one day. She had read Ulysses, and she wondered if she could do the same herself, whether she could actually use that as a way of shaping the material more firmly. But this rather basic plot is filled out backwards by what Woolf calls her tunnelling process. You'll notice in the extract I'm about to read, and it will be the last one, extract 10 on your handout, which opens Mrs. Dalloway, that though we start in the present, on the day of Clarissa's party, and also of Septimus's suicide, we quickly move backwards and forwards in time. In that passage about Bond Street, you noticed, didn't you, that she's already thinking back to her uncle, who turned in his bed and said he'd had enough. Or she's also thinking forward to her party in the evening. And in this opening passage, she's thinking backwards to her childhood at Burton, forwards a little to her feelings for Peter Walsh at Burton, then to the present, and further forward to Peter's anticipated visit, which will, of course, take place. All this, I suggest, is an attempt to be nearer to what she thinks of as reality. Reality as Virginia Woolf, influenced, no doubt, by Bergson's theories of times, and philosophers like Freud and Jung are beginning to think is the true state of the inner workings of the mind. In the process, Virginia dismisses the possibility also of being able to give character in the old-fashioned way, and refuses to detail Clarissa's appearance, although she does tell you that her neighbour sees her as looking rather bird-like. And at the same time, and with the apparent truth to life that Virginia seeks, another of the novel's important characters, Peter, is slipped into the narrative. I just would like to read you some of this opening passage and then to conclude. Mrs. Dalloway, this is the book, the opening of the book. Who is Mrs. Dalloway is the first question. Do we know in real life who somebody is when they're introduced? No. Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself, for Lucy had her work cut out for her. The doors would be taken off their hinges. Rumpelmayer's men were coming, and then thought Clarissa Dalloway, what a morning, fresh, as if issued to children on a beach. What a lark, what a plunge, for so it had always seemed to her when, with a little squeak of the hinges, which she could hear now, she had burst out into the open air, plunged at Burton into the open air. And so she thinks back to her childhood, which helps you to fill out the action backwards. It's a very good opening passage because it creates questions, and you spend quite a lot of the time looking, reading more carefully and following up what she's doing. And Peter is introduced into her mind because he had been madly in love with her at Burton, although she chose to marry the more dependable Richard. The extract ends with one of a number of devices introduced by Woolf to help shape what might otherwise be rather chaotic, a chaotic flood of thoughts, impressions, and sensations through the striking of Big Ben, and that goes throughout the book. So you don't have to think, help, where am I? Because you know it's 11 o'clock or you know it's 12 o'clock, and you are helped to some extent to feel less lost in the book. The book moves, and this is very important, I think, to what she wants to achieve. The book moves on two planes, prose